Okay, welcome back, everyone. Again, thanks to our first two speakers. We have three wonderful talks coming up. Our next speaker, and I have a conflict of interest in saying that, but our next speaker is my colleague from the Harvard Business School, Francesca Gino. Francesca is part of what I would think of as a fairly new community of scholars, people who are in something that seems to be going under the name behavioral ethics. Francesca is probably the most productive person alive in the field of behavioral ethics. And she's going to be presenting her research, which is going to connect conflict of interest to dishonest behavior. Welcome, Francesca.
Thank you, Max. And I'm actually going to start off by saying that I'm going to change the title to the presentation. I thought quite a lot about what to present in front of this audience. And as Max was saying, a lot of my research is around subtle factors in the environment that actually lead even good people to cross ethical boundaries. But what I decided to do today instead, given the topic of the conference, is actually present some data, some new data that we collected on patients, doctors, and also medical sales reps to tie it in with some of the things that you're going to hear about later on in the presentation, and also referring back to some of the things that already we've heard about in the first couple of presentations. And I should say that, as you can see from this slide, this is actually research in collaboration with Dan Ariely at Duke University and Janet Schwartz also at Duke. As you can see from the title, in looking at the data and preparing these presentations, I became a little bit sad in noticing that, as we heard before, these conflict of interest are present across all sorts of settings. For today's presentations, I'm going to focus in particular on doctors. But let me tell you, we have some interesting data on accountants and other contexts, also academics, and we also see conflict of interest there. And given the sadness a little bit of the data, let me start with a joke. I think this cartoon actually does quite a good job at describing how conflicts of interest happen. And as the literature suggests, one of the things that you might think works with conflict of interest is actually being explicit and disclosing it. And I don't want to take away the punchline of the research that you're going to hear about with Don and Sunita, but let me just tell you that disclosure doesn't quite work the way we think it does. And it can have some perverse effects that we might not expect. So in looking at some of the literature on conflicts of interest, in my view, there are two main streams of findings that I find quite compelling. The first is around the fact that this conflict of interest oftentimes happen unconsciously, and this is research that Max has done also with Mazarin and others. And the second stream of literature is trying to focus on solutions to conflict of interest, so disclosure, but actually showing that there are some problems with that too. And I'm going to skip over on the main findings so that their punchline is still there. Now, what we're doing in this research, as I said, we're focusing on doctors in particular, and we're trying to ask a slightly different question. We're interested in seeing whether people recognize that there are actually different types of conflict of interests, and we're interested in seeing whether people think that different types of conflict of interest affect doctors' decisions in different ways, and what happens when a patient actually develops a relationship with a doctor. And at the same time, what happens when a sales rep develops a relationship with the doctors? What do those relationships do to trust, and what do they do to the way people think about conflict of interest and disclosure of conflict of interest? So I'm going to present you with some data from 2 or 3 studies. And the data is somewhat preliminary, but I think it does a good job at preparing what's coming next in suggesting that disclosure or conflict of interest might have these perverse effects. So we conducted the first study on a large group of patients. And what we were interested in doing is putting patients in a position of going through a scenario where they decided that they received a recommendation from their doctors, and the doctors had two options, medication A and medication B, so a very simple scenario. And then the doctor tells the patients about some personal conflict of interest that he or she has. And in this case, we're telling the patients that the doctor decided to recommend medication B. Now, here's the type of conflict of interest that we thought might be interesting to look at. And if you see in the list, we vary from conflict of interest that seems to be related more to finance. So for example, the fact that the doctor has a significant number of shares in the stock of the company that makes the medication, or the fact that the doctor is paid for giving speeches in support of this medication. And then there are other types of conflict of interest that you can think of as more social. So the fact that the doctor, for example, is doing some research on the side effects of this medication, or that the doctor is doing some research on the effectiveness of this medication. And the question that we wanted to explore is whether people, if they're presented with all these different types of conflicts of interest, whether they actually think differently about them and think differently about the influence that they have on the doctor's recommendations of medication B. So this is a big sample, about 1,100 participants, and this is what we find in the data. So first, the data suggests that yes, when it comes to be presented in a very explicit manner of these conflicts of interest, people do distinguish between what we call the financial conflict of interest versus the social conflict of interest. But what is interesting here is that people actually have the perceptions that they matter. So this is a 1-7 point scale. And they think that the financial conflict of interest matter more than the social conflict of interest. Now, I was looking at some data the other day coming from actually a different sample, a sample of doctors. And we put them in the exact same scenario. And what was fascinating about it is that the data was exactly the opposite for them. So what they think is that the financial conflict of interest don't have a lot of influence on their recommendations, and instead things like doing research on side effect and effectiveness might. So this is related to this idea of differences between our own biases and the biases of others. Another interesting debate that we looked at is whether the fact that the doctors recommended medication B with this different conflict of interest being disclosed is something that benefits the doctor or that benefits you. And again, we see the same difference that I was showing before. I think what's interesting here is that 50 was labeled such that, in that case, you're indicating that that recommendation benefits you and the doctor equally. And we would expect, or I would have expected, that everything would be close to 0. And that is, in fact, not the case. And once again, if you look at the sample of doctors, the results are actually, they don't look this way. And again, they reverse in terms of the benefits that financial conflict of interest versus social conflict of interest have on the doctor's recommendations. Now, we also looked at the impact of conflict of interest, in a sense, on others. As I said, as part of this trying to get our hands dirty in trying to study conflict of interest with doctors, we were interested also in these differences in perceptions between the self and somebody else. And here we are asking them, if you were actually in a situations where there was a conflict of interest, what would you do? And what we were interested in seeing is whether people would actually remain attached to their relationship with the doctor, or they would think about going somewhere else. And this to me was quite interesting. So if you look at the percentage of people who chose any specific answer, most of the people actually would ask the question about whether the conflict of interest has an influence on the recommendation or not, but then they would actually end up following the advice, suggesting, as I think we'll learn more from Sunita's presentation, that people really care about maintaining a good relationship with their doctor. So maybe not surprising, but certainly I wouldn't expect over 30 people to pick that answer. If we think about whether people in their own shoes are in situations where they're thinking about their own doctors and whether a conflict of interest influenced the decision of their doctors. I'll show you the result in a second, versus, again, other people's being influenced by conflict of interest. This is what we see, and I know that there is a lot of messiness on this slide. What I would like you to pay attention to is the following, is the fact that people who should be more careful about the presence of conflict of interest and the fact that they affect their doctor's decisions are actually the people who are less able to recognize the influence of conflict of interest. So in this case, we're looking at the data by looking at whether people have a personal doctor versus not, and also whether they're on a medication at that particular moment or not. So these will be the people who you might think might be most at risk of being affected by conflict of interest, and they seem not to be aware of them. Lastly, I want to give you another couple of measures that we collected from these groups of patients. First of all, when you ask them whether their doctors across several domains have ever disclosed a conflict of interest, most people say no. So even if we study it and look at the effect of disclosing conflict of interest, it seems like it's not quite used as a strategy. And actually, interestingly, if you look at doctors themselves, they suggest that about 20% of them suggest that they actually talked about a conflict of interest when it was in place, something that I thought was quite low as a percentage. And finally, if you asking people whether they ever thought about a conflict of interest, and now that they know that they exist and that they have the influence that they have, whether they're likely to ask, this is what we find. And once again, what I find fascinating is that if you look at the middle answer on this scale, we are well below that, suggesting that people tend not to think about conflict of interest. They don't tend to think about the consequences of them on their doctor's recommendations, and at the same time, they are not telling us about the fact that they're going to change their behavior going forward. So this is just a very simple study, but I think it makes a couple of very interesting points. The first is that people don't seem to be thinking too much about their conflict of interest, and when they do, it's all about other people's doctors and not theirs. And it seems like they think about talking openly about conflict of interest as something very difficult that might affect actually the relationship that they have with their doctors. And then interestingly, in this study, it seems like that people think differently across different types of conflict of interest, and in particular, this dimension of financial versus social conflict of interest. And again, I just want to remind you that when you look at the sample of doctors, the results are exactly the opposite. Let me tell you about a second study that we did in which we actually still used the scenario but introduced a couple of manipulations. And what we wanted to look at is this idea of having a good relationship with your doctor versus visiting a new doctor. And at the same time, looking at whether there was no conflict of interest or whether there was a conflict of interest that was disclosed and it was financial versus it was disclosed and it was social. So also in this case, we have quite a big sample, and this is a sample of a general population, again, most of them patients. So you don't need to read the scenarios, but we are in a similar situations like the one before, where we're telling people that they're getting a recommendation from their doctor, and in this case, the doctor is somebody new that they're visiting for the first time, or is actually a doctor that has been their longtime doctor, and they have a relationship with this person. And once again, the recommendation that the patient gets is go with medication B. And what we did is varied the type of conflict of interest. So in one case, there was no conflict of interest mentioned. And then in the second case, it was disclosed and it was financial. And in the third case, it was disclosed and it was social. So here are some of the measures that we captured. What we were interested to start with is how the extent to which they thought that medication B was actually the best option. Again, very simple scenario, it's just B or A. And we gave them some information about this medication, it doesn't make any difference, and how likely they would be to actually follow the recommendation. So this is what we find. So interestingly, in this case, when we vary the type of conflict of interest across subjects, so between subjects, we see no difference between the financial and the social. So that's something that people capture only if they're all presented in front of them at the same time. And as you would expect, people are more likely to follow the recommendation when there is no conflict of interest. But interestingly, when there is a relationship with the doctor, people tend not to discount how that relationship actually affects the advice that they're getting. And again, maybe this is not very surprising, but it's interesting to think about the fact that this type of relationship might actually make us exacerbate some of the biases that we have when we need to think about the influence of conflicts of interest. We also looked at the likelihood of people of going to a different doctor and getting a second opinion, and the results mirror the results that I just presented. And once again, interestingly, the relationship is such that you want to maintain it, you don't want to offend your doctors. This is something that we actually saw in their answers, and so you stick to the doctor that you have. And this is also true when you start varying the scenario such that there are side effects of medication B, or that medication B actually costs more than medication A. Even in those cases, people still go with the recommendation that the doctor is giving them of following the recommendation more when there is actually a relationship with the doctor. And we only have some preliminary data from a behavioral study, but even the preliminary data is consistent with what we're seeing here, where there is a consequence of actually following the recommendation, and you take on that sort of cost because you want to maintain your relationship with your doctor. Now, why is that? What we find is that when a relationship is in place, again, maybe not surprisingly, people develop a sense of trust with their doctors, even in cases in which we are dealing with simple vignettes like that. And that trust makes them believe that the advice that they're getting is actually good advice. So this is just to show that the mediation is actually there. If you look at why patients that have a long time relationship with their doctors tend to follow biased recommendations, even when a conflict of interest was disclosed, we explained that by looking at their level of trust. And as I said, we have some nice preliminary evidence suggesting these are actually findings that are not related only to medicine, and they replicate also in behavioral labs. So let me conclude by telling you some of the stories that we've heard when we had the opportunity to talk to some other people on a different side of the transaction. So as I said, when we started, we were interested in the patients, we were interested in the doctors, but we were also interested in the perceptions of people who are in the position of creating conflicts of interest in the same place. And we conducted quite a few interviews with them, and I came out of those interviews a little bit disgusted. So what is clear about sales reps, there are some that get hired. This was actually a fun story. Some of them get hired just to be entertainers. So they have no knowledge of the medicines whatsoever, and what they do, they take parties out for dinner, movies, etc. But I just want to share a couple of stories that they shared with us. So one of the medical sales rep that we talked to said, I witnessed doctors asking for recommendations for diagnosis and procedure codes that will increase the amount for which they are able to bill during an office visit, despite the fact that they have not necessarily done said services. So this is just an example of a financial conflict of interest. And we have more. I've been in many situations where a physician would admittedly not recommend the best medication for the patient because it would impact their bottom line for the worst. If doctors speak for a product, they tend to prescribe more of it. So you can see all the kinds of conflict of interest that we actually tried to capture earlier on in the study. This is another one, again, talking about the influence of a conflict of interest that arises when the doctor is being paid for speaking in favor of a certain medication. And so now maybe this evidence is not even surprising given what we learned from the presentation just before mine by Reed. But what I find interesting but worrisome about these vignettes and these stories is that there is a huge sales force out there that is very much aware of their influence on their doctors. And interestingly enough, when they have a relationship with their doctors, things actually get worse. So there is a sense that strategically, these people are actually developing relationships, they're developing trust so that they can be more influential in what they do. So one of the questions that we asked them is, this is a subsample of the people that we talked to. We asked them how much they believe that each of different factors contributed to the doctors using a product, and some of them are related to their relationship with the doctor. And what I found quite interesting, if you look at the percentage of sales reps who report a particular factor at the top of their list, 21% of them say that when they have an established relationship with the doctor, that seems to work quite nicely. And as I said, as you were showing up in the interview over and over again, it seems like to be a very conscious effort and strategic choice on their part. And lastly, when we asked them a bunch of questions about statements related to doctors in general, again, maybe not surprisingly, they recognize that they have a whole set of tools and strategies in place to affect the doctor's decisions, and they know that the conflict of interest are there, and they're very, very powerful. So where does this leave us? So I want to go back to the questions that we asked at the beginning. And obviously, as I said, this is just trying to scratch the surface of what I think is an incredibly interesting phenomenon that has been studied not only with people putting individuals in the fMRI machines, but also, as you'll see from Don and Sunita, also with very convincing behavioral studies. But going back to the questions that I asked at the beginning, so are conflict of interest the same? So the simple answer is no, as long they're all presented at the same time. It seems like patients and doctors have a very different understanding of the influence of social and financial conflict of interest on their choices. And as I said, patients believe that the financial ones are more relevant and they're more influential, and the doctors actually believe just the opposite. And then to the question of how is it that these conflict of interest influence the decisions that the doctors give to their patients, I think that we start to have quite convincing evidence that they definitely do. But whenever there is a sense of trust or a sense of relationship with the doctors, it's very difficult to discount the recommendation that the doctor is giving in the second place. And I think all of this data needs to be analyzed or understood in the context of the conflict of interest as represented by this medical sales rep. And I think that there are equivalent groups of people in other contexts related to accountants, academia, et cetera, et cetera. So as I said, we're moving forward with some of the behavioral study building on the same factors that we explored here. And in the general discussion, I'm actually curious to hear some of your ideas because we have access to a panel of over 500 oncologists and actually 500 doctors as well. And so some of the interesting things that we could explore with them. And thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. So there's a variety of ways to introduce our next speaker. One would be to call him the foremost expert on overconfidence, a topic that's part of the behavioral decision theory literature. But Francesca's talk actually led me to think that I should talk about disclosure. And I'll start by disclosing that Don was an advisee of mine at Northwestern, where I chaired his dissertation committee. So sort of if you're wondering whether or not it was appropriate to invite him or not, at least I've disclosed my conflict of interest. Now, I tell you that for a couple of reasons. One is that a common pattern in the real world is that when some group of professionals is facing some sort of reform, and they realize something's going to occur, and they can have some influence on what that reform will be, they typically opt for disclosure. And as we're going to learn, the disclosure I gave you and the disclosure that auditors provide you has some very strange properties that I think that you'll find surprising. In fact, Don's work with Dalian Kane and George Lowenstein probably provides the first classic reference on the topic of conflict of interest from a behavioral ethics perspective. So we're going to hear about that and some of his other work on conflict of interest in his next talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. So the previous speakers have done an excellent job, I think, clarifying some of the complexities, the difficulties surrounding conflict of interest, and in particular the ways that they influence us in ways that we aren't consciously aware of. And underscoring the problem that many have mentioned, that corruption may not be the heart of the issue, but unintentional bias may be a better description of what's going on. So the definition that is, I think, consistent with the other talks is that conflicts of interest are a situation in which a person, such as a public official, an employee, or a professional, has a private or personal interest sufficient to appear to influence the objective exercise of his or her official duties. And I've done work, some of it with Max, that highlights the unconscious nature of the influence of conflicts of interest, that trying to be objective isn't good enough because, as Reed and Mazarine pointed out, the psychological processes at work often operate outside of conscious awareness. And as Max mentioned in my introduction, the most popular solution to conflicts of interest when it comes to policy is disclosure. So this is the solution offered by the ethical guidelines of the American Medical Association, Professional Association of American Journalists. It is at the heart of a lot of campaign finance reform. It is part of Harvard's new conflict of interest policy, that disclosure is supposed to help. And it's so popular in part because for those being regulated, those with the conflicts of interest, the professionals for whom the conflict of interest could threaten the objective delivery of their duties, it is the lesser of the evils. If the alternative to disclosure is divestiture, where you actually have to get rid of the conflict of interest, you have to stop taking payments from the consulting company, you have to stop accepting gifts, lunches, reimbursements from the drug company, you'd much rather just disclose the fact that you're getting them. Now, some very smart people have suggested that it ought to work. It may limit firms and regulators' liability, so they like it for that reason. And it's perceived to work for a variety of reasons. So Healy and Palapu write in the accounting literature, by creating minimum disclosure requirements, regulators reduce the information gap between the informed and uninformed. The intuition behind the effectiveness of disclosure is consistent with Justice Louis Brandeis's quotation that sunlight is the best disinfectant. If there's something unsavory going on, just letting everybody know what's going on is probably the first best response. The research that I want to present today and that Sunita will build on in her presentation suggests that it's not that simple, unfortunately. So we heard already that conflicts of interest are a more insidious problem than most people assume if they're thinking it's about corruption and not unconscious bias. And now I'm going to tell you that the most attractive solution to conflicts of interest doesn't work always the way that we would hope. So the implicit rationale for disclosing conflicts of interest is that they cause the recipient of information or advice to discount the advice in proportion to its potential for bias. It's unclear how it influences advisors if it increases advisors' consciousness of the potential for bias, if it distorts the advice that they're getting, if it gives more accurate, if it leads advisors to potentially give more accurate advice given the knowledge that the person whom they're advising might be viewing their advice more skeptically. All of these motivations play into how disclosure works. So if they operate well, then disclosure can be effective. My critique of disclosure today is not that it never works, but that it always has effects that run counter to its intentions. It can work, but it can have perverse effects under circumstances where advisors engage in greater exaggeration. They change their behavior as a result of knowing that the person whom they're advising will know about their conflicts of interest, and in circumstances where it morally licenses that advisor to indulge more in their bias. For advisees, there are related problems. So knowing that your advisor has a conflict of interest, that your doctor is getting payments from the drug company whose drug they're prescribing, it can be difficult to know how exactly to adjust that. So knowing that, how much do you then decide you're willing to pay to get a second opinion? And there are some circumstances, as Sunita will talk about, that hearing about a conflict of interest from the person who's got that conflict, your doctor says, now I should tell you before I send you to this clinic that I'm a partial owner of it, and so you going there will generate some income for me. Under some circumstances, that can increase trust in the person who's providing that disclosure. Also a potential problem. So today I want to present some experimental results relevant to 4 propositions. First, that advice will be biased in the direction of incentives, no big surprise. That advice will be more biased with disclosure. So an advisor with a conflict of interest will provide worse advice when they know the recipient of their advice knows about their conflict of interest. Third, that disclosures will be insufficient to offset the bias that's generated by the conflict of interest in the first place, proposition 1, and that disclosure will increase the variance of advice. Recipients' behavior will vary more because they're not sure how to process the information, that the disclosure of a conflict of interest raises uncertainties for them, including uncertainty about how the advisor has actually been influenced by the conflict of interest. The bottom line then will be to increase payoffs, increase the welfare of advisors with conflicts of interest, and decrease the payoffs for the people who they're advising, the people in their care who are depending on them. So the context we examine is closer to real estate agency than to medicine. We had participants in our study advising each other about the value of homes that had sold in Pittsburgh. These were primarily Carnegie Mellon undergraduates. There were estimators and advisors. Participants were randomly assigned to the 2 roles. Estimators were trying to estimate the sale prices of 4 actual houses. They got pictures of those houses and then a bunch of information, a little bit of information about those houses. They were advised in this estimate by advisors who got a whole bunch more useful information about the home, including its assessment by the city of Pittsburgh and a number of other relevant facts, comparable homes in the neighborhood that had sold. So the advisors were better informed than the estimators. And estimators always wanted to estimate the actual sale price accurately. They got paid more when they did so. Under some conditions, the aligned advisor incentives, the advisor shared those payoffs. That is, they got paid more when the estimators made the best estimates they could. In the conflicted interest condition, a conflict of interest was present such that the advisors wanted their estimators to overestimate the value of the home. Might be somewhat more parallel to the actual incentives faced by real estate agents, who, as long as they're getting a percentage commission, benefit more when the home sells for a higher price. The estimators and advisors were paired for 4 rounds, so it's not a long relationship, but it does provide some opportunity to develop a reputation. The way that it worked is each got to review information about the house. The advisor then sent a report in which they provided specific advice. On this house that you're estimating now, I think it's worth, and then they wrote down a specific number. They wrote down their participant code, but nobody found out who the other person actually was, and so we attempted to maintain anonymity that way. In their own handwriting, the advisor was required to write in the conflicted condition something like this. Well, they had to write this verbatim, actually. As an advisor, I'm required to inform you that I am paid based on how high your estimate of the property sale price is relative to the actual sale price. In the aligned condition, where advisor and estimator faced the same incentives, this message, when it was disclosed, they also had to write the same message, but instead of how high, it was how accurate it is relative to the actual sale price. And of course, in the undisclosed condition, there was no such note. Estimator got advice without knowing about the payoff scheme faced by the advisor. The estimator's incentives were like this. So if their estimate was within each of these values relative to the actual price of the house, then they earned the amount in the second column for that round in the experiment. And as I said, there were 4 rounds. When advisors had incentives to bias their estimator high, their payoffs looked like this. When they were aligned incentives, their payoffs again looked exactly like those of the estimator who they were advising. The question that we wanted to ask was, of course, how the presence of the disclosure of conflict of interest would affect the kind of advice that advisors gave. The results look like this. So we had 4 rounds to the game again. We counterbalanced the order of the houses to avoid a confound there. What you see, so columns labeled A, that's aligned. AD is aligned with disclosure. So those two look pretty similar across the board. So when I disclose to you that we face the same incentives, it really doesn't change my behavior all that much. When the advisor had a conflict of interest, so they got paid more when the estimator overestimated, they gave worse advice. So the H columns, the third column over, consistently higher than the first 2. And HD is high disclosed. So that advice came with the proviso, I'm getting paid more when you overestimate the value of this house. That advice is consistently worse. The net effect is, of course, that advisors make more money in the presence of disclosure than when not. In the 2 accurate conditions, since their payoffs were aligned, they made the same. No interesting difference there. When advisors had a conflict of interest, that wound up benefiting them at the cost of the people who they were advising. That's the difference in the high cell. And then for high D, the disparity was even larger. So the disclosure of conflict of interest, at least in this setup, wound up benefiting those making the disclosure of the conflict of interest. So that raises the question, why didn't the customers, why didn't the estimators use that information about the conflict of interest better? Why didn't they discount more? This graph shows the relationship between advice and estimate. So suggestion here at the bottom. That's the advice that the advisor gave. And the 4 lines are the 4 different conditions. So this, of course, is the high disclosure condition. Relative to the actual price of the home, that is the condition in which there was the highest advice. And indeed, we see that participants, the estimators getting that advice, discount it more than they do in other conditions. But it's not enough. So the advice they discount it more, but the advice gets worse. And so on balance, they wind up overestimating more than they do in the absence of the disclosure of the conflict of interest. One other thing I should point out, I think it's useful to compare the conditions in which the conflicts, in which the advisor's incentives are disclosed, the accurate disclosure condition here at the top, and the high disclosure condition here at the bottom. The R-squared accounted for in these best fit regression lines is substantially higher here. What does that mean? That means that there is a stronger correlation between advisor's advice and what the estimator reported. They knew they could rely on the advisor. They could have somewhat more confidence in them when the advisor's aligned incentives were disclosed. So there was a strong correlation between advice and estimators' reports. In the presence of disclosure, you get a whole bunch more noise. So estimators are less certain. They have less useful information because, yeah, they got advice, but they're supposed to discount it, and exactly how much they're supposed to discount it depends on how the conflict of interest affected the advisor, but they don't know that. 2 possible explanations for advisors' behavior. The disclosure distortion, the fact that the disclosure of the conflict of interest made things worse. One is moral licensing, that by telling about the conflict of interest, they feel absolved of responsibility to care for the person whom they're advising. They feel morally licensed to indulge in their bias. The second is that it's what we're calling strategic exaggeration, which is to say, they know that the other person is going to discount their advice, and in order to counteract that discounting, they exaggerate more in order to get their advice back to the place that it would have been if their conflict of interest had been kept a secret. The problem with strategic exaggeration is that it's a little bit unclear, if you're trying to be maximally strategic, which direction you should go. It's possible that the disclosure of the conflict of interest leads to greater scrutiny by the estimator, and so you ought to dial it back a little bit in order to make your advice believable. So in the earlier graph I showed you, I drew best fit linear regressions. What our participants told us when we asked them how they thought their advice would affect the estimator is more consistent with a curve where advice can get too extreme. So there is some point at which advice gets so high that it's implausible, so you wouldn't want to go that far. There is some optimal level of advice for maximizing what the estimator thinks the house is worth. If the disclosure of the conflict of interest brings greater scrutiny, then it might lead you to show more restraint. If, on the other hand, it leads them to sorry, lost what I was going to say. If it leads them to discount your advice, then you want to exaggerate more, and that's the exaggeration line on the right. So because of this uncertainty, we were skeptical that strategic exaggeration was the full story. We attempted, nonetheless, to examine it in a study with 364 participants where they answered a hypothetical scenario about how a conflict of interest, the disclosure of a conflict of interest would affect advice they were giving to someone else. They imagined playing the role of advisor with a conflict of interest, and they gave advice under 2 scenarios. They were asked to imagine giving advice under 2 scenarios. They answered the following question: if your only goal was earning the highest payment for yourself, how would your advice compare depending on whether the estimator knew you had a conflict of interest? So consistent with the uncertainty that I described just now, Some said that they would give higher advice with disclosure. Some said that they would give lower advice. And then a substantial proportion said that that disclosure would not affect them. So if this is an accurate reflection of how people think about the consequences of disclosures of conflict of interest, we might not expect that strategic exaggeration plays a big role in influencing how it affects advice. Another study, again, suggestive of a possible role for moral licensing. Here again, participants were playing a hypothetical game in which they were having an estimator guess about how many jelly beans there are in a jar. They had better information than the estimator, and they got paid more when the estimator guessed higher. All participants read both A and B below, counterbalanced. Either you suggest a number above 2,900 in hopes that the estimator overestimates the number of jelly beans in the jar, and the estimator is aware of your $50 incentive, so it comes with the disclosure of your conflict of interest, or the estimator is unaware of your $50 incentive, and then the question is, which is perceived as more ethical? And clearly our participants told us that it's more unethical to give this biased advice when the other person doesn't know about the conflict of interest. That it's more okay to do it when they know. Again, not conclusive proof, but suggestive of the possibility that disclosing conflicts of interest make it more morally acceptable to at least some participants to engage in bias. Small picture on these results. I believe that this could be described as an existence proof. Again, my co-authors and I do not claim that disclosure is always bad. There are probably some circumstances in which it winds up being a net benefit. It increases the efficiency because the estimators, the people receiving the advice, are experienced and have a good sense of how the conflict of interest, when they learn about it, has biased the advice that they're getting. But in circumstances like our lab paradigm, or as Ulrike Malmedier has shown in many investing situations, naive investors, when they hear about a conflict of interest in the stock analyst whose advice they're hearing about, they don't know how to interpret that. And so they can't use it to discount that person's advice about whether to buy a stock. We think that the evidence is more consistent with moral licensing than with strategic exaggeration, and that it connects to a variety of other important research, fairly recent in behavioral ethics, that suggests that in many domains people behave as if they have some sort of moral set point. After they've behaved virtuously, they are then permitted to be a little bit bad. And after they've been bad, they feel some need to cleanse or to show that they're good, and they'll behave somewhat more virtuously after having indulged in a behavior that they might not find ethically approvable. I think that more research is needed on when disclosure helps and hurts. So again, I think that this is our results suggest it doesn't always help. And important questions remain about the circumstances under which it helps and it hurts. And as I said, when the receivers of advice are savvy and experienced, that's probably the best circumstance to expect it to help. Bigger picture, my co-authors and I see this as part of a larger project on the implications of psychological factors in conflict of interest. They do have implications for individual behavior and also the efficacy of different potential institutional or policy responses. We realize how this research isn't hopeful in the sense that it suggests the most attractive solution, the cheapest, most efficient solution to conflicts of interest, the most popular, can't be counted on to work in the direction that most of these policies advocates suggest that they ought to. And it's one small example of one of the ways that psychology can contribute to discussions of public policy. It is often the case that such conversations are dominated by economists who play very useful roles in the discussion, but whose simplified models of human behavior can often omit important features. So the finding that I began with the fact that when conflicts of interest influence behavior, that it so often operates via unconscious bias rather than conscious corruption, has profound implications for policies on things like fraud, where if you're going to prosecute someone for fraud as a result of perhaps a conflict of interest, the law says that for it to be fraud, the person who says it must know that it's false when they say that, at the time that they say it. If they've persuaded themselves that it's true, then it doesn't qualify as fraud. And the psychology literature would suggest that legal precedent is highly problematic in that domain. James Surowiecki, in writing about the conflicts of interest inherent in the roles of financial professionals in the New Yorker, wrote, "It's become a truism on Wall Street that conflicts of interest are unavoidable. In fact, most of them only seem so because avoiding them makes it harder to get rich. They don't want to have to divest themselves of these conflicts of interest because they pay off so handsomely. That's why full disclosure is suddenly so popular. It requires no substantive change. Transparency, disclosing those conflicts of interest, is all well and good, but accuracy and objectivity are even better. Wall Street doesn't have to keep confessing its sins, it just has to stop committing them," which may be a tall order. And Dalian Kane and George Lowenstein were important co-authors in all the steps of this project and are continuing to work on this problem. So much credit goes to them. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Don. And our last speaker is Dr. Sunita Saw. I didn't stutter there. Sunita was a physician in the UK, and then a few years ago she returned to Carnegie Mellon to get her doctorate under the guidance of George Lowenstein and Don Moore. And she's now a postdoc at Duke. And as long as I've known her, she's been obsessed with the issue of conflict of interest in the medical world. Welcome, Sunita.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here to presenting today at this Symposium on Conflicts of Interest. And Don has already given us some great presentation on disclosure, and my talk this afternoon is also going to be challenging whether disclosure can be an effective fix to conflicts of interest. And disclosure can have tricky, unanticipated effects on both advisors and advisees. And we've seen how disclosure can cause advisors to give even more biased advice. And now I want to look at the other side of the equation. What is the impact of disclosure on the advice recipient? So keeping that advice constant, what effects happen to the advice recipient? So I'm not interested in whether the advisor gives more or less biased advice. I want to look at holding that advice constant. Are there additional problems upon the advice recipient? And before I begin, if you just want to take a look at this cartoon and imagine yourself as a patient in this situation. So you're at the doctor's office, the doctor's finished examining you, and you hear your doctor say these words: "Under disclosure rules, I'm required to tell you I own stock in the company whose drug I'm prescribing." So how would that make you feel? How many people here would want to discount what the doctor has just told them? Okay, quite a few of you. And how many people wouldn't care at all about this disclosure statement? How many people would not know what to do? So my additional questions are, would you feel more uncomfortable now to turn down the doctor's advice for a fear of signaling distrust to your doctor? Or would you feel increased pressure to help your doctor? So these are my research questions, and I'm going to propose that disclosure is actually going to increase the pressure to comply with an advisor's recommendation. And that's going to be for two reasons. Now, first of all, the patient in the previous situation probably wants to avoid appearing as if the now disclosed conflict of interest has corrupted the good doctor's advice. They don't want to signal distrust to the doctor. They don't want to insinuate that the doctor's biased in any way. So whereas prior to the disclosure, there could have been a whole range of personal or medical reasons why they didn't want to take the doctor's advice, such as, for example, that, oh, I think that treatment's too painful or too risky, or I prefer a treatment I've already taken. Now that the disclosure has been made salient, it's more likely to be interpreted that is because of the disclosure that the patient is saying no, and this signals distrust. So even if the reasons were still medical reasons or personal reasons, rejecting the advice with disclosure has a larger bearing on the relationship. It signals distrust to the doctor, or at least the reasons going back to the doctor are unclear. Is it because of the disclosure, which signals distrust, or is it really because of that personal reason that you're telling me? So I call this effect insinuation anxiety, or some kind of feeling uncomfortable to turn down the doctor's advice for a fear of signaling distrust to your advisor. And a second reason might be that you might feel obliged to help your doctor. So much in the same way that we feel obliged to help someone that asks us, such as a panhandler, somebody asks for help, you feel obliged to give. So central to most conflicts of interest is the fact that the advisor is going to gain if the advisee takes some action that's against his or her own self-interest. So for failure to take such an action effectively deprives the advisor of such a gain. And there's been research on reluctant altruism that shows that people feel pressured to behave generously in certain situations when they would rather have not been in that position to begin with, which is shown by the classic behavior of crossing the street to avoid the beggar. And I know that one is, imagine, for example, there's a tip jar situated between you and the sandwich guy at the cash register. So the proximity of both the tip jar and the sandwich guy increases the likelihood that you're going to leave a tip. So if the tip jar was around the corner out of sight, you probably feel less pressure to leave a tip because the sandwich guy can't see whether you leave a tip or not. And if you're unaware of the tip jar, then you could even claim plausible ignorance as to whether the tip was required or even appropriate. So I call this effect the panhandler effect. Instead of being a warning, disclosure can become a burden on those that it was supposed to protect, increasing the pressure to comply with an advisor's recommendation. So my two hypotheses are, first of all, with disclosure, the advisor is going to trust the advice less. And that's pretty straightforward. There's going to be uncertainty now as to whether the advice that's given is biased or not. So did the advisor have my best interest at heart, or do they have an eye to their own self-interest? However, at the same time, the advisor is going to feel increased pressure to comply with the advisor's disclosed interest. And that's because of the reasons that I've just discussed, a fear of signaling distrust to the advisor, or this increased pressure to help the advisor. Now, these two hypotheses actually work. They give opposing forces as to whether the recipient is going to take the advice or not. So they feel decreased trust in the advice, but they also feel increased pressure to follow the advice. So the recipient is in an affective bind. They're stuck between this rock and a hard place in that they want to discount the advice, but they also feel increased pressure to comply. And this becomes a burden on them when they're making a decision about the advice that they've received and whether to follow the advisor's recommendation. Now I'm going to test these hypotheses in a series of experiments to really look at what is this impact of disclosure and what causes this increased pressure to comply. And the first experiment I'm going to describe is going to be in a medical context, and then I'm going to go on to describe more experiments in a more general context. So first of all, in this experiment, participants take the perspective of patients. So they're asked to read about the brief history and current symptoms of a patient and a common situation that they might face at a doctor's office. So they're asked to listen to a voice recording of the doctor who makes two options, and they recommend one of the options. So the advisor gives the same recommendation in all the conditions. So again, I'm holding that advice constant. I'm not looking at whether the doctor's going to give more biased advice with disclosure. I'm just holding that advice constant and looking at the impact on the patient. So for example, one of the situations was that the doctor's going to recommend that the patient takes either a standard drug or be entered into a clinical trial. And the doctor's going to recommend that the patient be entered into the clinical trial in all conditions. However, in the disclosure condition, the doctor, there's an additional sentence where the doctor reveals this common financial conflict of interest and says, I do think it is important, however, to let you know I will receive a referral fee from the manufacturer of the drug if I refer you for the clinical trial. So after hearing what the doctor says, the patient then writes down their considerations, and they answer a series of questions regarding how much they trust the advice, how much they trust the doctor, and how uncomfortable they would feel in turning down the doctor's recommendation for a fear of insinuating that the doctor is biased. Now, what I'm interested here to look at is whether these two opposing forces are present on the patient when they're making a decision about their care. And seen as though they're opposing, the net effect is indeterminate. So I'm less worried about whether they take the doctor's advice or not, because again, they can't tell whether the quality of the advice from this, whether the advice that they're given to be entered into the clinical trial is good or not. And what we find is, with disclosure, which is the light blue bar here, you can see that trust is significantly decreased. So you could argue this is the intended effect of disclosure, is that people should hear the disclosure statement, they get that information and they discount. They trust the advice less. However, at the same time, they also feel more uncomfortable. They're worrying about turning down the doctor's recommendation with disclosure for a fear of insinuating that the doctor is biased. So these two forces, these two opposing forces that put the patient between a rock and a hard place, are present when they're making a decision about their medical care. And both of these effects mediate, they explain the relationship between disclosure and taking the doctor's advice. So now that we've tested people's intuitions and we can see that these burdens are on the mind, I want to move to a situation where people are making real choices in some incentive-compatible lab experiments where it really matters to them. And in these situations where it's face-to-face and it matters, I'm going to predict that this latter force, this increased pressure to comply, is going to be even greater, because people often underestimate how embarrassed or how anxious they're going to be when they're currently not anxious or embarrassed. And further, Francesca has already described how patients often think that their own doctor can succumb to a conflict of interest, but other people's doctors may do so. And patients seem to be particularly reluctant to acknowledge this. And indeed, previous research has also shown that disclosure can signal an increased professional standing, or that a doctor who invests in a drug company might be more knowledgeable about that drug company, or might have more expertise in that particular area. And so if industry pay a doctor, they could be a leader in the field. So to combat that, this time I want to give recipients of advice full information. So any variance that happens in discounting is not perceived to be due to the differential knowledge between the advisors. And because the recipients have full information, they can also clearly tell the quality of the advice and whether the advice is good or bad. So these studies are called the die roll studies, where people roll dice and they can win prizes. And this time there's two types of participants. There's advisors and choosers. And advisors have to give choosers advice on which die roll lottery they should pick, die roll A or die roll B. And die roll A is always more attractive than die roll B. In fact, it's more than 2 times the expected value of die roll B. And pilot studies shows that pretty much everyone, over 95%, prefer die roll A over die roll B. And giving a lottery is quite a good proxy for advice given in many different situations. Even though we're giving them full information, there's still uncertainty in the outcome. And with medicine, whenever you're recommending a treatment A over treatment B, there's also going to be variability between patient and uncertainty in that treatment outcome. And the same with in other contexts as well. So if you have a financial advisor recommending between an investment package A or B, you're also going to have uncertainty in that outcome. Now, advisors fill out a communication form that they hand to their chooser in person, which has the information of these die rolls, and they circle their recommendation, either A or B, and they give this form to the chooser. And the chooser has to circle in front of their advisor which die roll they want to pick, either A or B. However, some of the advisors are subject to a conflict of interest, in that they're going to be rewarded if they can get the chooser to pick die roll B, which is the inferior die roll. And in the disclosure condition, they have to write out a disclosure statement, word for word, on that communication form that they hand to the chooser, telling them about their self-interest. In the no disclosure condition, they don't write anything about their self-interest, and it's not mentioned to the chooser. And there's also a no conflict condition where advisors are rewarded regardless of what die roll the chooser picks, and they can give clean advice. And what we find with no conflict is that, indeed, advisors give very good advice. They recommend the superior die roll, the majority of them, and pretty much all the choosers pick die roll A. So that's pretty much like the pilot studies for having no advisor and reflects people's preferences. However, when there was a conflict of interest, pretty much all the advisors recommended the inferior die roll B. And there was actually no difference between the disclosure and no disclosure conditions in this, but I'm just going to focus on those advisors that recommended die roll B. And when there was no disclosure, pretty much half, about 52% of the people complied and followed that advisor's advice. So there's many things going on with advice, but I want to have a look at what the difference between no disclosure and disclosure. So with disclosure, if you think that the choosers were just going to ignore that conflict of interest statement from their advisor, then you should see about the same amount complying. However, if they really discount the advice, they lose trust in the advisors, then far less will comply. And if they feel an increased pressure to comply, then you might see that creeping up a bit. And what we found was that 81% of people complied with this inferior advice with disclosure than without disclosure. And when we asked the choosers about their feelings after they'd made their choice, but before they'd rolled for their prize, they said with disclosure they're significantly less pleased with their choice. So there's no cognitive dissonance here. They're not happy. They're not satisfied with the choice of die roll that they picked. They felt significantly less trust in the advice, but at the same time, they felt increased pressure to help their advisor. And they also felt much more uncomfortable to turn down that advice with disclosure than without disclosure. So this time, these burdens were serious enough in that they affected their compliance with seriously bad advice. Now, you can view disclosure to have basically two components. One is an informational component, and the other is a social component. And what I'd like to do in the next study is separate these two components and see what's really happening there with the disclosure and why we can explain what's happening with this increased pressure to comply. Is that compliance really coming from increased pressure, or are there other social mechanisms that are at play? So in this study, we can ask the question, what would happen if we gave choosers information about the advisor's conflict of interest, but this time from another source, not from the advisor, from an external third party? So we have the same die roll as before. We have the same two conditions, no disclosure and disclosure from the advisor. Then we add on this other condition, which is external disclosure from a third party, and that we give the choosers information about the advisor's conflict of interest in their instructions, so it doesn't come personally from the advisor. So the information is the same here, but we're separating the information and perhaps the social component that's coming from the advisor. And what we find here is that again, with the difference between no disclosure and personal disclosure was similar as before. More people complied with personal disclosure. But when there's external disclosure, if any mechanisms that are coming from that information, such as fairness or equality to the advisor, you'd expect the same compliance as with personal disclosure. But if there's something else going on, then maybe that's less. And what we find is that with external disclosure, it really decreases the compliance, and far less people take it, the same as with no disclosure. And when we measure their trust, you see with both types of disclosure, external and personal, trust is significantly decreased compared to no disclosure. But there's no difference in the decrease in trust. There's no difference in trust between the two disclosure conditions. So it really seems that the informational component is driving this decreased trust. So that's where the transparency aspect of disclosure, that's what it's trying to get at here. But when you look at our measures to look at the increased pressure to comply, you see that it's personal disclosure that's driving this. When the disclosure came personally from the advisor, they felt increased pressure to help their advisor, and they also felt more uncomfortable to turn down their advice with personal disclosure rather than external disclosure. So another way to test this social component is really to, first of all, keep the source the same this time. Previously, in that experiment, we varied the source, but if we keep the source the same, but this time vary whether the advisor knows about the disclosure or not, we can test this further. So this time, we have three conditions: personal disclosure from the advisor and two external disclosure conditions. One, which is common knowledge, where the advisor knows about the disclosure and one that's not common knowledge. So for the choosers in external disclosure common knowledge, they're told that they're told about the advisor's conflict of interest, but then they're told your advisor knows that we've told you this, but you shouldn't discuss it with your advisor. When it's not common knowledge, we tell them your advisor does not know that you've been told about this, and you should not discuss it with your advisor. And what we see here is, again, when the source is different, when it's external disclosure versus personal disclosure, there's a big difference in compliance. But this time, we've been explicit and we said that the advisor doesn't know about that we've revealed his or her conflict of interest. And so rejecting the advice can be less offensive. It's more about the advice than the advisor. There's no signal of distrust that goes back to the advisor, seen as though they don't know that the recipient knows about the conflict of interest. However, what's happening with external disclosure when the advisor does know? If it's just the informational aspect, then you should expect it to be the same as the first bar when it's not common knowledge. But if it's about the signaling aspect to the advisor, you'd expect increased compliance. And that's what we see. We see increased compliance. So it really seems to be the signal to the advisor that's causing this effect, that they don't want to signal distrust to the advisor, or they don't want to show that they're unwilling to help the advisor. And another way to test the inference of the social rules of disclosure is to have a look at what happens when the decision is made in front of the advisor versus being made in private. So again, we keep the information the same, we keep the source the same, this time from the advisor, but we change whether they make the decision in front of the advisor or not. So in all the previous experiments, they're making their decision in front of the advisor. But this time, if the advisor gives them the communication form with their recommendation and then leaves, what does the recipient choose? And we see with no disclosure and disclosure, far less people comply in general, but there's still a significant difference between no disclosure and disclosure. So there's still something going on there with disclosure that's lingering when they're making their decision in private. But as we know, when it's made in public, as in the previous experiments, it's far more, the effect is far more. So another question we can ask these people who made this decision in public is, are they aware of some force that the presence of the advisor created a force that made them comply? Are they aware on some level of this? So once they've made this decision and the advisor now leaves, we give them an opportunity to change their mind and see when they can revise their choice. Do they still comply? Do they remain consistent, or do they change their mind? Now, one of the alternative explanations that people often say for this increased compliance is that, they're trusting the advisor more, or that they feel they're rewarding the advisor for being honest, or there's some kind of reciprocity going on there. And if that's the case, then they shouldn't change their mind. But what we find is that when they have an opportunity to revise their choice, they certainly do, and far less people take the inferior advice when they can revise their choice and make a decision in private. So publicly they're complying, but privately they have a different opinion. And again, when we measure the increased pressure, we see with both disclosure, which is the outer two bars, there's always an increased burden in that they feel increased pressure to help the advisor, and they also feel more uncomfortable to turn down the advice. But this is significantly more when the decision is made in front of the advisor than when it's made in private. So private decisions do decrease the burden, but not completely, as we still see it's higher than that with no disclosure. So what we've shown here is that we know that disclosure is popular. Don has described various situations in medicine and academia and business where disclosure has been probably one and the only policy recommendation for managing conflicts of interest. So we know it's very popular. And we see that there are some benefits, that people do decrease trust when they hear disclosure from their advisor. However, that decreased trust happens within a relationship. And disclosure creates dynamics where it becomes more difficult to turn down the advisor's recommendation, and it really increases the pressure to comply, which comes with this social component of disclosure. And we ruled out the fact that it's not fairness, it's not equality concerns, it's not rewarding honesty, or any kind of reciprocity concerns. It really seems to be this increased pressure to comply in that they don't want to signal distrust to their advisor. They don't want to insinuate that the advisor is biased. And they do feel this increased pressure to help the advisor, but reluctantly. And there are ways that we could decrease that pressure, as we've seen. So external disclosure is a way, but unfortunately, it was the when it's not common knowledge condition that was the best there, and we're never really going to get a policy implemented by telling recipients of advice that your advisor has a conflict of interest, but the advisor doesn't know about that. So if there's some way that we can give disclosure which is more removed in time but still salient, that could be a possibility. And private decisions on cooling off periods also decrease the burden. Not completely, but they do help. And so making a decision perhaps away from the doctor's office in the privacy of your own home could help, or having a chance to look at an investment option that you've signed up to and having a cooling off period would also help. And these series of studies basically add to the evidence that we've seen today that sometimes disclosure can be detrimental. Even when recipients of advice were savvy, they have full knowledge, and it's a one-off interaction that they're having, they still have these relationship concerns, and they're particularly reluctant to communicate distress. So disclosure introduced this quite serious perverse effect in that it increased the pressure to comply with the advisor's recommendations. And as Don was saying as well, there's multiple aspects to disclosure, and we need to explore further the situations where transparency can be good and transparency can be bad. But we know with the evidence that we have so far that disclosure isn't a panacea to conflicts of interest. We might need to try harder to look at ways of how to manage conflicts of interest than just recommending disclosure, or whether we could even eliminate those conflicts of interest in the first place. And we do need to be really, really cautious, because instead of being a warning, disclosure can really become a burdensome request to comply.
If I can invite